Well, what I learned, what was for me interesting when I came to Cooper Union, was also kind of in a way a shock a little bit, because we had sort of all these amazing faculty. John Haydock, Peter Eisenman, Raymond Abraham, Bernard Schumi. But this thesis class was like, John Haydock came in and basically said like 3 words and said like, I'll see you in a month. And I said, oh, where's the program? What am I supposed to do? Right? Because in Germany you get the program, you do a museum, you do a bus stop, you do this, you do that. And at Cooper was like, you come up with something, that's your thesis, right? And at that, when I realized suddenly, it's not like I'm just answering a kind of program, and designing something. It's like I'm actually coming up with an idea what architecture is supposed to be. And that was kind of a really key moment, that I suddenly realized it's not so much like that I'm supposed to design a museum and I just start drawing something. It's like, it's sort of, how do I see the world of architecture? And it's kind of funny, there was a book just by Joseph Giovannini, just came out a couple of weeks ago, Architecture Unbound. And my thesis work from Cooper Union is all over this book. He's completely he was fascinated with this work that had been done, which it's about, I don't know, different ways of visual representation, but that was kind of interesting that in talking about the school in Germany, it was very, in a sense, very traditional, and I realized that the minute I got here, that's not how you think about architecture. And I mean, this is sort of, architecture is not bound into a kind of program given to you. So you design a museum or something. And so I then for me it was clear that I could not return back to Germany. It was sort of, I guess you guys also stuck here, right? Once you come to New York, it's hard to leave. But in those days, New York was also, for me, fascinating, because I actually, before I became an architect, actually, I was an artist. I worked as an artist. And I did very kind of strange things, and I was afraid that I could never live doing things like this, I mean, of course, over time I learned like maybe it would have been easier being an artist than an architect. But coming to New York, in those days, New York was the place. The art world was super interesting at the time. Andy Warhol was like in every sort of party, club, whatever, and all these kind of Basquiat and all these people were actually around. Keith Haring, they were not. Warhol was famous, but others were not necessarily famous. Keith Haring was not famous. A friend of mine said, "Oh, Keith Haring's a party, but let's not go. It's boring." It was the kind of, it was sort of. It was just New York in those days, and it was super interesting for me, and I basically never slept. At night I was in clubs, and during the day I was at Eisenman's office, and so I didn't have any time to think about should I go back to Germany or not, and this kind of never occurred to me. So, yeah. The office was fairly small. He had just kind of started. He wanted to become more commercial in a way. And he wanted to be more successful, being hired. I mean, there were his buddy like Richard Meyer was successful. He got all these buildings, houses built in museums, whatever. And Peter was he was too much into theory and not so much into practice. But he was trying to change that. So he partnered with somebody more conservative, let's say. But he had sort of asked me to come to his office, and we did this competition in Germany for the right at the Berlin Wall, actually, which was still around in those days, and it's kind of like it became very messy, right? We were like making models, and so that his partner at some point said, like, these guys, they have to be out of the office. This is too crazy. So we continued this project in the Institute of Urban Art, what's it called, Institute of Urban Studies. So we moved like a few blocks from his office, and then we continued the project there. And then Peter was traveling, and the deadline came up, and he said, "Okay, so you bring this stuff to Germany." And he says, like, how is it going? He said, like, it's almost done, not quite, but he said, okay. So we got on the plane, and I remember this, like, I was on the plane with an X-Acto knife cutting the model, which today would not be allowed anymore, with a knife on an airplane. And so keep working on building the model on the flight to Germany. And then I met Peter in Frankfurt, and we got in the car and drove to Berlin to prepare for the presentation of the and we were still like, we had still one night and one day, and we were still working this model. And Peter said, okay, let's just do it. And Peter started getting into it as well. So, he still played with spray paint, and his shoes got all full of red paint, and he was completely, he suddenly became, started working on this model as well. So it was sort of very funny because we brought this model to presentation. I remember Peter was making bets with one of the Japanese competitors that we would win, and they brought in, the Japanese brought in all these perfectly finished models, and really, and ours looked like a mess. It was kind of, but we got it together, and eventually we won the competition actually, and built part of it. Not what we really, the main part was not built, but part of it was built. So I remember this when Peter was like really, and so we worked then on the Wexner Center, which I remember also where we got sort of quite involved in, and we had what was kind of fun with Peter that we had actually really interesting dialogue. He wasn't just saying this is what we're going to do. He was, we were discussing things, and I learned from him how he looks at things, but he also listened to me in terms of what I thought was maybe not working well. So it was kind of actually interesting collaboration. Eventually, this became a little bit less over the 10 years because the office got bigger, and even though I was basically in charge of design of all the projects in these 10 years, but the exchange became a little bit less over time. And at some point, I thought maybe it's time to change. It's good for him, good for me, but it was a kind of really important, interesting time for sure. I don't really like to talk about philosophy of design because it's sort of, for me, it's sort of. How should I say? As I was saying earlier, it's really about the ability to provoke a kind of change in whoever experiences or uses the space, so it's not so much about program. Currently, I'm teaching at Pratt, and I don't give a program, but I don't give the students a program because I feel the program is a kind of is easily used as an excuse to do something that does not necessarily have any kind of meaning in a certain way. It becomes a very formal exercise, and just sort of like the explanation becomes the excuse for the design. Here's the front door, here's the cafe, here's this, and so I think it's a kind of reductive idea towards the potential of architecture, and it's not really architecture. And I tell my students, you can stick a program in there if you want to. If you give me a good argument why and what it is, but if there's no program, as long as I can occupy the space. That's for me the kind of probably one of the big differences between sculpture and architecture. It's occupiable, but other than that, I'm more interested in hearing why you did what you're doing, rather than checking all the kind of conventions of like here's the front door and here's this and here's that. And I mean this works of course in the upper semesters. I think maybe in the I don't know. I don't teach the younger students. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what I would do there. But well, there's one project that was really kind of really interesting to me. I was a friend of mine. Her friend was interested in building a house upstate, and he had a twin brother, and they were both surgeons. And they work, the one was tall and skinny, the other was short and skinny, and one was a brain surgeon, the other was an eye surgeon. So very special kind of, a person to be able to do this either. And they were twin brothers, and it was really kind of very interesting. So now if I remember, he was the brain surgeon or the eye surgeon, but it doesn't matter. One of them, he took me to his apartment and to show, to kind of, I guess to show, it was kind of absolutely amazing. It was a giant loft in Soho, and it had no rooms. It was basically a big loft, but it had stacks and stacks and stacks of books, basically squares, like 1 meter by 1 meter square, and about like maybe 60 centimeters tall. And it was like a city grid, books everywhere. And his bed was also, there was half of the bed was filled with books. And I was like, oh my God, this is completely insane. This is like, fantastic. Right? And then the other brother, who was gay and lived with his mother, was kind of really interesting. When their mother was 80 years old. So he had a party once, and I invited him to come to this party, and I went there, and he had also a loft in Soho, big loft in Soho. And that loft was kind of completely different. It had a big piano in the middle, and it was like plants all over, and the plants were clung to the window. So it was clear to me he was not living in this loft. This was not for living. He lived with his mother uptown. His loft was just for, I think, because his brother had a loft. He also needed a loft, something like that. So there was these plants clinging to the light, right? And so he had this party, and all the other party guests were like 5 other people, elderly women, all in their 80s and 90s. And I was like, wondering whether one of them was his mother. No, his mother wasn't there. So it was so like he had some cheese, and he started cutting the cheese and feeding everybody. It's kind of the strangest event, right? And so then the two of them decided, I was like, okay, there's 2 really weird clients. My first clients are probably the strangest clients you can imagine. So, but then they decided they had this fantastic site upstate with a waterfall, and that they wanted to bring the mother up there to have the mother look at the site and show what the house should be like. And so there was a big deal, but the mother couldn't walk, so they designed a rickshaw for her, like a thing they could carry her, and everything was ready to go. And then the day before, they canceled. And I said, why are we not going? Because the mother doesn't have the right shoes to go there. So that's kind of basically the context of the client, right? And so the house eventually I designed. I was sort of interested in this twinness of the two, and I looked at kind of the kind of psychology and came up with God, no, I can't remember. Came up with this now I have to remember, famous psychologist, with this sort of diagram of a kind of concave mirror. What happens when you look in a concave mirror? The mirror image actually appears in front of the mirror, and rather than behind. And so I was interested in this whole Lacan's, right? Yeah, Lacan's diagram of the kind of the mirror diagram, this idea of twinning, and so that and that became the kind of diagram for the house. So the house actually has a right side up and an upside down position. Right? So part of it is right side up, and it's basically twisted so that you have this kind of intersection. So what is the floor of one of the twins, it becomes the ceiling of the other, and what's the floor of this twin, it becomes the ceiling. So it's this kind of inversion of the two, right? And so the house was completely, in a way, insane in that sense, because the living room was at this steep incline, and one of the bedrooms was this steep. It was kind of, for a normal client, probably, are you crazy? This is, but so they loved it. But eventually, what happened now, so like they wouldn't build this thing, but what happened now is the gay brother who was living with his mother, he suddenly decided that he became, affiliated himself with this female opera singer. And everybody's like, the mother's, I thought you're gay. And well, maybe he was, it wasn't, I don't know, but she kicked him out. And the two brothers got into arguments because of, because he changed, his personal relationship with other people changed, and everybody was like, what's going on? And the whole thing fell apart. So then they stopped with the project, they didn't want to build this anymore, and it was like unfortunate. So the house ended up in the Museum of Modern Art in their collection, but it was kind of a really complex story. And that was my first client project. So they're like, well, this is kind of really interesting. And for me, it was kind of really a beautiful moment to be able to explore this idea of film and architecture, because I think, if I remember, there's two movies that inspired me in a certain way, and one is Peter Greenaway's The Cook, the Thief, the Wife, and is it Her Lover or His Lover? The Wife and Her Lover, I guess. And because the camera moves basically just horizontally back and forth. It's not like, like most movies, cameras all over the place. The camera is very, very simple, but it moves back and forth, and in front and behind scenes, and for me that was kind of really very interesting. This kind of minimal movement, but it's all about movement nonetheless, and that the movement reveals things that whatever happens or so on. And the other one was Stanley Kubrick's Space Odyssey 2001, yeah. I think, right? Yeah. Because there's what I loved about this that was very interesting, the way that how Kubrick represent the idea of weightlessness, which I thought was very interesting. These scenes where joggers keeps running in this moving thing, or like this woman walking and upside down and walk, and those were for me like, wow, this is really, really cool. So this idea, of course, architecture, you can't quite do that unless you kind of you involve some kind of robotic mechanisms, but that wasn't really possible. But so the other thing was, I was interested in a museum, right? This kind of to challenge this kind of authoritarian idea of what museum institutions are. Right? The first thing we did was like, okay, the entrance is the sign, and the front door we couldn't do much because the building was under historic preservation or something like that. So it was not a lot we could do, but so what we did is basically the sign of the museum. By entering the museum, you break the sign. You open the door and the sign is part of the door. So you basically break the sign, right? So like you kind of already violate this whole idea of a museum as a kind of authoritarian institution, right? That's the beginning. And the sign is made out of a translucent mirror, slightly translucent mirror pattern. It's a grid pattern, which is, like the kind of the thinness of filmic imagery. It's all, the kind of that was part of this idea that this representing the thinness of it all. It's it can break easy, it can disappear easy. The kind of the idea but also that when you enter, now you're entering into a different world. Right? And so once inside, the walls are all leaning, some more than others, but they're all kind of leaning. They're all a little bit crooked in a way. What happens is actually there's moments when I could show you when you go there. There's moments where the wall looks straight, corners look perfectly straight, but then when you keep moving, you realize they're actually not. So this idea of things are in flux, that in that sense for me it was like architecture is actually moving. Right? As you move through it, architecture is actually also changing. And the theater itself was kind of, I wanted it to be a bit like the Kubrick spaceship in its experience. So there's a slight ramp, you go in, and suddenly it's all in Yves Klein blue. It's this intense color, and the seating is actually slightly floating from the, so that you because you're in a different, in watching movies, you're in a different world, right? You're in this kind of completely imaginary world, and so you need to be removed from reality in a certain way, and that was sort of the idea, and then there is another thing I was interested in, because into the Museum of Modern Art, there's always a room that has black curtains, it's pitch dark, and you go in and you watch some kind of movie. And I said, this is really, this is, again, it's one of these museum entities making this piece of art so sacred, and that why would you not have these video presentations in the middle of where people walk, right? And so we did in the amphitheater upstairs. You actually, there's a video screen, and the stair comes from underneath the screen. So the idea is that actually the visitor, if you sit there and watch a movie, conceptually the visitor is actually stepping out of the screen into the space, right? This idea again, you're in and out of the reality of movies. And every person becomes in a certain way an actor in some sense, right? So that video screening amphitheater is part of your circulation through the museum. It's not kind of made into a sacred kind of special spaces. So it's and so like the idea that you actually fluctuate between reality and imaginary world, and this kind of the world of film and media, which also, by the way, was for us important to push the museum, because before we started the museum was very much into Hollywood film thing, and when we came in, we pushed the museum with and they were completely into this as well, into media art. It's not just Hollywood film, right? Hollywood film is something, but there's moving image is also media art. So the whole facade actually, and so like the digital world, which was a sort of an important aspect, also digital media artists and so on. So the facade actually of the building is kind of based on a digital wire grid. If you look at the triangles, it's a wire frame that you would basically, if you work with computers in 3D space, you're very familiar with this. So we want, and the color is also the color of this light blue. Blue is the color of the digital world. So we wanted this implied in there that you actually this becomes a kind of familiar territory in a way. So even the floor, most people think it's white, but it's actually not white. It's very, very light blue, and the facade is sort of light blue. So it's sort of, without being specific about it, but it implies a certain kind of understanding of this is not just Hollywood, and this is not where this is somewhere else, and that was sort of kind of important for it. But the idea of motion throughout, that the building itself has this sense of nothing is kind of static. That was kind of important.